Please remain standing for the invocation by Father Bob Nelson.
Thanks. Last Monday we celebrated what's now called President's Day, giving us a 3-day holiday. But the holiday started as George Washington's birthday and actually apparently never been officially changed by Congress to President's Day. And is further confused that in fact, George Washington's birthday is actually tomorrow, February 22nd. As compared to many of today's politicians who seek to be president, George Washington said this on being elected: "My movements to the chair of government will be accompanied by feelings not unlike those of a culprit who is going to the place of his execution." But he's also quoted as saying, "It's the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful of His benefits, and to implore His protection and favor." History is important, as George Santayana, who lived from 1863 till 1952, said, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Museums and groups such as this are probably the best way to help us not only avoid being condemned to repeat the past, but also to welcome the future and minimize the chances of war. For those of us who believe in a supreme being, a creator God who cares for His creation and seeks for all to be one in worshiping Him, we give thanks that we have memories and the ability to reason and to study the past and the ability to choose our course for the future. We give thanks to our Creator God for all of those who have worked and in many cases given their lives to bring us a society embracing peace with justice, people who've dedicated their lives to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. We give thanks for all the many dedicated people, many here tonight, who have made this museum a reality. And we give thanks that we are able to assemble openly in peace and to study and commemorate the past. We ask our one God of all to bless and protect this group of people who have gathered today as we meet and as we travel home. We ask for help in making the choices that will enable us to become and continue to be instruments of peace with justice. And finally, we ask for help in embracing the future in ways that will bring us closer to meeting our God's desire for the world. Amen.
Thank you to our honor guard and to Father Bob for helping us open this meeting. I would like to welcome you to the 20th annual meeting of the Nevada Test Site Historical Foundation. 20 years. Hard to believe. I'm Nelson Cochran. I'm the vice chairman of the foundation. I have one little announcement. Dale Frazier informed me that we have sold 1,000 bricks so far, and the last bricks are being placed out in the garden out there. We're halfway to Bruce Church's goal of 2,000 bricks. Tonight we will report to you on the key activities and accomplishments of the foundation and the National Atomic Testing Museum for the past year. We also have a very interesting talk by Dr. Vince Houghton, who's a historian and curator of the International Spy Museum back in Washington, D.C. A little bit of history. How this foundation museum came about was unique efforts, several organizations. I would like to recognize two in particular who have continued to support us to the beginning. They are the Department of Energy, National Nuclear Security Administration, Nevada Field Office, and the Nevada System of Higher Education Desert Research Institute. From the very beginning, when this museum occupied a room over in the North Las Vegas facility, the Nevada Field Office has provided the space that we reside in, and they continue to do that. If that did not happen, we would not be a Smithsonian affiliate, and we would not be a national museum and maybe we would not exist at all. So the foundation would like to express our thanks to the department, in particular to Darwin Morgan, who has been here through the long haul and continues to be here through the long haul. The building that we're in is a Nevada State building, education building, managed by Desert Research Institute. Their support of all the years we've been in here since 2000, well, it started in 2003, we actually opened the museum in 2005, has been outstanding. All you have to do is ask them for something and they figure out. I'd like to thank Peter Ross, who is probably stranded in Reno, and Paul Pate. Is Paul here? From DRI? No? Who've been here again for helping us out. I'd like to recognize some people who have purchased tables for this tonight. They are Pat Arnold, who is stranded in California trying to get here. Linda Smith, who braved the snows from Logandale. John Longnecker and Associates, Mission Support and Test Services, SOC, Desert Research Institute, and I'd also like to thank Dale Frazier for purchasing all the beer tonight. Thank you for your generous support. I would like to recognize some people here who are attending tonight. However, the weather has crossed everything up, and so I'm just going to go ahead and go down the list. Hopefully they're here, and hopefully I don't miss anyone. Troy Waite, Emeritus Chairman of the Foundation. Troy's up here. Pat Arnold, who I mentioned before, who is the grandson of Herb Greer, the second G and EG and G. He lives in San Luis Obispo, is a trustee and is actually our treasurer. I already mentioned Darwin Morgan, who's the director of the Office of Public Affairs, DOE, NNSA, NFO, try that 3 times. We have a special guest who came in, Glenn Mara. Glenn Mara is a former Livermore and Lannell Deputy Lab Director. He was a VP of University of California. Now he says he consults a little bit, but he says one of the things he's most proud of is he's been a longtime supporter of the Nevada mission. Thank you, Glenn. Did City of Las Vegas Councilman Starvis Anthony make it? I thought I saw you. Thank you. We also, I think, did the newly appointed County Commissioner Michael Naff make it? No. Is Demi Falcon, Congresswoman Titus, Political and Finance Manager here? They all left, okay. We have Brian McAnally here from Porter Group. He's helping us out. I did not see, Bruce Church didn't make it either, did he? Leanne Heron couldn't get on a plane. How about Brett Valdez? Brett, you're with Nevada State Bank, right? Correct? Janice Boronil, is that right? Did I kill it? Figures. Jim Holt, former president of NS Tech and a foundation trustee. Have down here Bonnie Longenecker, but who is the CEO of Longenecker and Associations. John tells me she couldn't make it. Mark Martinez, president, MSTS. John Benner, vice president, MSTS. Really asked about Paul. Anthony Mendez, SOC. And finally, Megan Comfort and Rosalie Hendrick of Nevada State Bank. Hopefully, I got everybody. I'm always very concerned about you miss somebody who you should really. My apologies if I did. Finally, I'd like to thank Michael Hall, who's our executive director, and his staff, and also the caterer at your service for putting together such a nice affair. Now, let me have John Longnecker come up, who is our chairman, and he is going to make an announcement about people who have been reelected to the board. John?
Thank you, Nelson. I would like to begin just by thanking you all for being here tonight. I know the weather was more than a tad challenging, and for everyone that turned out tonight, thank you for that. I am going to announce the results of the election of the Nevada State Historical Foundation Board. This is the first year we use online balloting. And so the results, thank you for all for participating, all of those of you who ran for re-election and all those who voted. Returning to the board are Nelson Cochran, Jack Doyle, Markall Patton, Peggy Hallerberg, Jim Holt, Linda Rakow, Linda I know is here, Harry Stinke, Robert Stoldow, Ernie Williams, Peter Zavataro. So congratulations. Could we have a hand for all of the returning trustees? So I'd like to begin tonight, and Nelson mentioned 20 years, just by recognizing Troy Wade, my friend and mentor, and everyone else in the room who did just heroic efforts 20 years ago to form this museum. What a fantastic institution. And you know, at the time, your vision and your energy and your perseverance just are what made this institution, both to get it started and to make it last through the years and be Smithsonian affiliated. So let's have a hand for Troy and all of those who are the founders of this great institution. And I'd just like to say there are exciting times ahead because Glenn and some of the other members here tonight who are going to be on our advisory council, we're now looking at where the museum needs to be in the decade ahead to make sure that it's better, stronger, and really as responsive as we can make it to the community, to the state, and to the nation to better reflect or to best reflect all of the things that Mark is doing out at MSTS, all the things that Lisa Gordon-Haggerty is doing in NNSA, and all of the tremendous things that the state has done in the past. As we go through that process over the next year, we're going to need all of your creative thoughts and energy to accomplish the planning as to where do we go in the future, what do we exhibit, where should we be located. But it's an exciting undertaking, and it's something that I'm proud to be part of and look forward to working with all of you.
Let's all give Nelson a thank you. He has to stand. He has to introduce everybody and thank everybody, but there's nobody to thank Nelson. So he devotes a lot of time to the museum. So I know he has all our thanks. I just want to point out a couple quick things. You see this annual report. We put a lot of work into this, and it really reflects a lot of the work we've done this year, and we've had a very good year. In fact, the past 3 years, the museum has enjoyed an extremely productive working relationship with the board, staff, stakeholders, and members. Attendance has continually grown, and the finances continue to remain in the black. So we've had a very excellent 3 years. I also take pride in the fact that we've worked very well with our building partner, the Desert Research Institute, as Nelson pointed out earlier. And we also always thank the Department of Energy Nevada Field Office for their great support. And we have a huge number of supporters, and we thank them all. Now, one thing, just in reviewing the year, one of the best things I think we did at the end of last year is we hired a new staff member. And it's my great pleasure to briefly introduce her. She's come on board as a Director of Strategic Initiatives and Philanthropic Partnerships. Krasinski, if you would stand up, and why don't you come up here for just a moment. A lot of you have had the pleasure of meeting Cree, but some of you have not, and she's been a wonderful person to work with. I've really, really enjoyed working with her these past months, and I'll just turn it over to you for a few moments.
Oh, well, I'll be very brief because you've got dessert in front of you and actually a very interesting speaker ahead. I just want to say thank you to Michael, all of the trustees for being so wonderful and welcoming, and my colleagues. It is a joy to work with you all. And this is very special because with working on this with colleagues, I saw many names floating around. So as I get to see your faces, it brings this all together. I would just say one thing that really has struck me the most is the dedication, the intelligence, and the commitment that everyone I have met has, not only to the work that's been done at the test site, the foundation, but also in advancing education and understanding of the importance of this subject and the security of our country and the world. So it's a really honor to be here, and I look forward to meeting all of you who I've not met and working with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and please, everybody take one of these home, and I hope you read it. Thank you, Nelson.
As you look through that booklet, towards the back, you'll see a couple of articles in there. One on Ink Gates, who was a manager here at the office during a very thrilling and exciting time. And the other one was Dr. Brownlee, probably one of the premier scientists who's worked in the nuclear weapons program, primarily in the area of containment, but he was all over, astrophysicist. And he was a character from the word go. You'll read a couple of little articles in there when you come to Pascal A, B, and C in there. They did some thrilling things out here. Okay, I'd like to have Jordan come up and introduce our keynote speaker. He is back for an encore performance.
Hi there, good evening. I'm so thrilled to have the honor of introducing our guest speaker this evening, not only because he is a very dear friend of mine, but also because he is one of the most dynamic and brilliant people with whom I've ever had the pleasure of working. And if you've seen him speak before, because he was here last year, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you have not, you are in for a treat tonight. Dr. Vince Houghton is the historian and curator of the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., where he and his colleagues are in the home stretch of bringing a brand new Spy Museum to life. The new museum will build upon the original, which was fabulous, and share stories of historical and modern-day intelligence work and the people who are critical to these important missions. Vince has spent the last 5 years with his colleagues amassing a world-class collection of artifacts to complement these new exhibits. I had the chance to get a sneak peek of the new museum when I was in DC a couple of weeks ago, and it's absolutely extraordinary. The original was one of my favorite museums, and this one is going to blow it out of the water. It is opening on May 11th. So if you find yourself in DC after May 11th, it is well worth your time to visit. In addition to all of that, he does a couple other things there. He's also the host and creative director of the museum's weekly podcast called Spycast, which boasts an annual listenership of more than 3.5 million people worldwide. It's about 25,000 people a week tune in. And in fact, if you tune into Spycast in the next couple of weeks, you will hear some familiar voices because Vince is recording a couple of episodes with some of our trustees here at the museum tomorrow. Vince has a PhD in diplomatic and military history from the University of Maryland, where his research centered on U.S. nuclear scientific and technological intelligence in World War II and the early Cold War. His master is also from the University of Maryland, focused on the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. He is a veteran of the United States Army and served in the Balkans, where he worked closely with both civilian and military intelligence agencies in several capacities. Vince is also the author of 2 forthcoming books, Nuking the Moon and Other Intelligence Schemes and Military Plots Left on the Drawing Board, which will be released by Penguin Random House in May, and he will actually be back here at the end of May to talk about the book and chat about the nuclear intelligence stories in the book, including a really good one from the Plowshare program, so make sure you are here. Don't miss it. And in September, Cornell University Press will release his book, The Nuclear Spies, America's Atomic Intelligence Operation Against Hitler and Stalin. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Vince Houghton.
Thank you, Jordan. After that introduction, keep drinking. Keep drinking. I've got to live up to that. So the more you have going down, the better this talk will be. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my second favorite museum in the world. And I work at one. I like the one I work at, but I love the Atomic Testing Museum. And I think that there's a natural partnership there between the International Spy Museum and this museum. Just there's so many things, I'm far enough away, there's so many things that bring us together and makes it a kind of natural relationship. More than just trash talking during the Stanley Cup Finals last year between Washington and Vegas. I'm not a Caps fan, so don't hate me. I like Vegas. I was one of the only ones that was kind of secretly undercover as a Golden Knights fan in Washington during that time. Yes. But as Jordan mentioned, we are also in the process of creating a new spy museum, and I know that here I'm very excited about the next iteration of the National Atomic Testing Museum, and looking forward to all the wonderful things that you guys have planned moving forward. So there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of things that make us similar to one another. I was going to say that both the Atomic Testing Museum and the National Spy Museum have overworked and underpaid staffs, but there's a lot more management here than I expected there to be, so I'm going to leave that out of the conversation. But really what brings us together is the focus on education. The educational mission of both of these museums is paramount, and that's why I work at the museum I do. My plan in life was always to go into the intelligence community, as Jordan very vaguely stated. I worked back in the 90s in several capacities with certain organizations. That was going to be my career. But I fell in love with the idea that a museum in Washington could be educational in a way that I never imagined before, and I see that here also. And the museums are so similar in that we both focus on a niche subject, right? We're not a big American history museum. We have a very specific subject. And more importantly, it's a niche subject that is tragically misunderstood by the public. These are important concepts, but because of pop culture, because of bad education, people don't understand the intelligence world the way they should, and people don't understand nuclear energy the way that they should. And so these museums are incredibly important in trying to correct that misperception of the public. And the thing that really I love, and I think these two museums have so much in common, is the confluence of history and science. That is just such a wonderful, for me as a historian of science, is my favorite thing in the world. I mean, obviously, the National Spy Museum focuses on history, but when you come to the new museum, you'll see that we're really branching out the focus on the science side of things as well. Not only the target of intelligence starting in the mid-20th century of other countries' scientific programs, but also how science and technology has been used to help us do intelligence better moving into the future. And of course, here, at the Atomic Testing Museum, you have that wonderful confluence of history and science. And what's great about it is, I'm speaking to the choir here, science is wonderfully dynamic. And so should a museum like this be about science and history, this dynamism that is true in science. I mean, scientists don't just stop when they think they figured something out. They push forward. They don't rest on their laurels. They constantly try to find what is the next big thing. You know, physics didn't end when Newton made his 3 laws. We'd be in the National Inertia Museum if that was the case, right? You know, you wouldn't have, you know, the great discoveries of the 20th and the 21st century to push us forward. What people don't quite understand is that history is just as dynamic as science. People kind of look at history and be like, oh, it's old, people, dead people. You know, we're focusing on things that just doesn't change. Once you know the story, then you know the story. Well, history is just as dynamic, and that's why I have a job, right? I mean, if history just kind of ended, then there wouldn't need to be historians. And so some of us in this room are very happy that history is very dynamic, but especially in intelligence. Because intelligence history is incredibly complicated in that most of the information we have out there, people don't want us to know. Or people have purposely decided not to allow us to see it. And so classification and things becoming secret or declassified means that things change all the time. And what I want to talk about tonight is this wonderful bringing together of history and science in a case study that has changed so dramatically since most of us learned about it. And I think it's perfect for what we're talking about. Or what buttons do I need to push? I'm a historian, everyone, not an IT person. So we want to look at the case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And this is a case that, of course, comes from the 1940s. The trial itself was in 1951, and the execution was in 1953. But for decades since then, there's been constant debate about whether they're innocent or guilty, should they have been executed, what really happened during this case that became known as the trial of the century. Well, one thing that we all, many of us, anyone here who is over 40, probably learned about in high school and college was information that was incomplete. And it was incomplete because there was a program called Venona. And Venona was a program of code breaking where we were breaking the Soviet codes during World War II that had been classified all the way up into the mid-1990s. And when Venona was finally declassified, the Rosenberg case completely changed. And most of us haven't really caught up with that. So I want to look at some of the conventional wisdom, what we were taught about this case and what we kind of think we understand about this. Well, the first thing is the Soviet Union stole through espionage the secret to the atomic bomb. This is something that's become just understood as conventional wisdom. This is what we were taught in school. Second, that this espionage allowed them to build an atomic bomb and build it much faster than they would have otherwise. That sure, maybe they would have gotten one eventually, but the espionage brought them to the point where they got a bomb way before we expected them to. Third is that Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were spies for the Soviet Union during and after World War II. Their espionage was instrumental in stealing and passing along the secret to the atomic bomb. And they were tried, convicted, and executed for treason for their role in the theft of the atomic bomb. So these are kind of what we were taught in school, whether high school or college. This was the conventional wisdom up until the mid-1990s. So let's kind of take this apart a little bit and go step by step. Let's start with stealing the bomb. Right, that first concept, there's no reason to try and execute the Rosenbergs if the Soviets never stole the bomb in the first place. Well, the perception at the time, this first bullet point, Ivan the Idiot, people thought the Soviets were stupid in the late 1940s, to the point where most Americans and most Westerners believed that Soviet scientists were too dumb to be able to create their own atomic bomb. There's a famous story. It's become more urban legend than probably reality at this point. It's more apocryphal. A man named Herbert York. Some of you might have actually known Herbert York at some one point or another. York was the chairman of the AEC. He was one of the first people to start writing about this publicly. And York had a joke that he told where people in the Pentagon invited him in to ask questions about how vulnerable the United States was to Soviet atomic bombs. And the fear that a lot of generals had in the Pentagon was that the Soviets would be able to miniaturize an atomic bomb small enough to fit inside a suitcase, right? Forget ICBMs, forget submarine-launched ballistic missiles. If Ivan could walk through JFK with a suitcase with a nuke inside of it, that means America can never be safe. So they asked Herbert, they said, is this something we're worried about? And York said, no, never happened. And the general's like, well, you seem pretty sure about this. Why are you so sure? And he says, I'm not worried about the atomic bomb part of it because the Soviets still haven't mastered the technology of the suitcase. That was, it's a little over the top. He's joking about it, but that was a perception that a lot of Americans and Westerners had of Soviet science during this time. The Soviets' greatest scientific and technological achievement during World War II that wasn't a tank was a two-seated tractor. Right? They're not building jet aircraft. They're not building radar systems. They're not building anything that we really were too worried about. So a lot of people had this perception that Soviet scientists were idiots, but it was a misperception. Soviets had some of the greatest scientists in the world. The Russians are known for their science. They invented the periodic table. They invented a lot of the physics that we actually believe and understand today. All we have to do is look at the post-Cold War world and the Soviet space program to know how good their scientists were. So this idea that the Soviets couldn't build a bomb on their own was perceived by many to be the case, but we know now was complete hogwash. Then you have the question of how important were the Rosenbergs? Well, the Rosenbergs weren't all that important in stealing the bomb. If it was stolen, it wasn't by them. It was by people like Klaus Fuchs, by Ted Hall, by Bruno Portacovo, by a man named George Koval, who actually was a member of Soviet military intelligence who infiltrated the Manhattan Project. We'll talk in a second about manufacturing process, because that was really a key component here also. There is some nuance to this. I'm not saying it wasn't stolen. The nuance, however, is focused on ideas of, did Stalin trust his own scientists? The irony is, we thought the Soviet scientists were idiots, so did Stalin. So Stalin, and another name up here, Beria, Lavrenti Beria, was the head of the NKVD. You might not have heard of the NKVD. They became a different three-letter name agency in the 1960s, known as the KGB. So essentially, the NKVD and Stalin believed their scientists were idiots too. So in many cases, information that came from people like Ted Hall, people like Klaus Fuchs, reinforced what his scientists were saying. So people like Igor Kurchatov, who was the Robert Oppenheimer of the Soviet bomb system. People later on, like Sakharov, people who, Peter Kapitsa, these are world-renowned scientists who helped build the Soviet atomic bomb, were telling Stalin, this is true. Stalin didn't necessarily believe them until Klaus Fuchs sent information from the Manhattan Project, or until Ted Hall sent information that confirmed what the Soviet scientists were saying. So there is some nuance here, but really what we want to talk about is the concept of basic science. I'm not going to get into a basic science lesson with a room full of scientists. I know I'm a historian, I know my limitations, but I'm going to let Glenn Seaborg speak for me. Glenn Seaborg, who you may know, was the man who discovered plutonium. He was also the head of the Atomic Energy Commission. He said this quote in one of his books that he wrote: "The only secret about the atomic bomb was whether or not it would work." And that question had been answered. That question he's talking about had been answered at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not to mention Alamogordo, New Mexico. So the concept behind stealing Soviet stealing physics secrets was something that most American physicists completely dismissed as nonsense, because everyone who was a self-respecting physicist in the world understood you could build an atomic bomb in 1938. When Otto Hahn and his team in Germany figured out artificial fission, within 10 minutes of learning that, Oppenheimer was writing stuff on the chalkboard and kind of drawing out a bomb shape. Enrico Fermi was doing the same. Well, so were people in the Soviet Union. They said, oh, well, this is interesting. Can we do this on our own? And the answer, of course, was yes. So it didn't take spies stealing information from Los Alamos. It didn't take espionage to convince the Soviets that nuclear fission can make a big boom. This is something they understood the minute everybody else did too. But let's talk about Julius Rosenberg. One thing we learned about Venona, right, this code-breaking program that was declassified in 1995, was that the debate that had been taking place about Julius Rosenberg as a spy was over. There's no more debate. My political persuasion is just to the right of Karl Marx. Right? I am as left-wing as they come. My really good friend is a guy named Mike Meerpool. Mike Meerpool used to be called Michael Rosenberg. He was the 10-year-old orphan son of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. I am very much someone who is a sympathizer to people like Julius and Ethel Rosenberg as true believers. But I can tell you Julius Rosenberg was a Soviet spy. There's no doubt, there's no question anymore. If you believed in the 1960s, if you had long hair, if you're like they were framed, Julius Rosenberg was a spy. And he was a spy for the Soviet Union. Not only was he a spy for the Soviet Union, but he gave them some of the most important information about American military secrets they could have possibly wanted. Things like how we actually created things, manufacturing processes. Some of his agents were actually people who were engineers within some of the most secret programs in the United States, like radar development, jet engine development. We'll talk about the proximity fuse in a second. Things like US air-to-ground radars. I've got a list, I'm not gonna go through every single one of these, but these are some of the most important military advancements during World War II that Julius handed over to the Soviet Union. The last bullet point is interesting, probably hard to read. Soviet radar production didn't exist in 1940. They didn't even understand the concepts of radar that had been worked on in the United Kingdom and the United States. But in 15 years, because of the espionage of Julius Rosenberg, they had equaled or even surpassed that of the United States. Now, things like jet engine design. I want to focus on that last one, the proximity fuse. This was developed at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory right outside of Washington, D.C. Arguably, this was the most important invention of the World War II period. I know I'm standing in the Atomic Testing Museum. You probably think there's something else that was important that was built during that time. Yes, I study atomic weapons as well. But the proximity fuse had a greater impact on war fighting than the atomic bomb ever would. The proximity fuse was exactly what it sounds like. Essentially, it was a fuse on the end of an artillery shell or an anti-aircraft shell or a missile that would tell the weapon to explode when it got close to a target. So you didn't actually have to hit the target with your missile. You could just get kind of close to it. Now, the importance of this would be certainly felt during World War II when our anti-aircraft weapons got really, really good at shooting down planes. Places like Okinawa and Iwo Jima would have been very much more bloody because of kamikazes if it wasn't for the proximity fuse. But if you remember from history, in 1960, an American U-2 pilot named Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union. He was shot down in a seemingly impossible plane to shoot down, the U-2. It flew higher. It certainly didn't fly faster. It was slow, but it flew higher, and it was supposed to be relatively invisible to radar. Well, how did they shoot it down? Well, they shot it down using a missile that had the proximity fuse that Julius Rosenberg handed to the Soviet Union. By handed, I mean literally wrapped up a proximity fuse prototype and gave it to his handler and said, I have a Christmas present for the Red Army in 1944. That same proximity fuse was used to shoot down Francis Gary Powers. The second last bullet point is interesting too, and then I'll move on. Mistakes and dead ends. Raise your hand if you're an engineer in here. I have some engineers. How important is it to know what not to do in engineering, right? Very, very important, right? How much time do you waste in dead ends and mistakes? What Julius was able to do through his spy, actually this is a whole spy ring, was to provide the Soviets what not to do, to allow them not to make the same mistakes that we did, to allow them to get beyond these dead ends, not waste the money, the resources, the time on working on things that didn't work. So Julius was a spy, but the bigger question for us today is, was he an atomic spy? Right? Did he hand over the secrets of the atomic bomb? Now, in the espionage world, there's something that I tell people all the time. Like, are you a spy? I'm like, no self-respecting spy would tell you they were if you asked them that question. But the more obvious answer to this is, I don't have access to anything anymore. Right? I don't have access to top secret information. I don't have access to anything that people might want to know in another country. So I would not be someone good to recruit, because I could tell you about the attendance at the International Spy Museum. I could tell you about our new artifacts, but I can't tell you anything secret. So the question we have to ask about Julius is, did he have access to any top secret atomic information? Well, he never left New York except for one time where he went to New Mexico. But for the most part, he spent his time in the East Coast, not in the Manhattan Project. Now, his access point was his brother-in-law, a man named David Greenglass. Greenglass didn't work for Oppenheimer. He didn't work for Klaus Fuchs. He didn't work for Edward Teller. He didn't work for Hans Bethe. I could go through the list. He didn't work for any of those people. He was a low-level machinist who never even saw the inside of a laboratory at Los Alamos. Right? He was just a guy. And supposedly, because of Greenglass, this is how the Soviets got the atomic bomb. Now, what evidence was presented at the trial? These two sketches. Now, the one on the left may look a little familiar. This is basically Fat Man. This is the lens design for the implosion bomb, the plutonium bomb. And one on the right is trying to be something resembling the uranium bomb, the gun design of Little Boy. Talked about engineers and scientists. How much information does this give you about the atomic bomb? Not a lot. Now, what's even more interesting when we want to talk about sources is that we have no idea if this is actually what David Greenglass passed to Julius Rosenberg, who passed it to the Russians. Because these two designs were what Greenglass reproduced for the trial 10 years after Rosenberg supposedly passed this information to the Soviets. So did these exist in the first place? We have no idea. This is stuff that Greenglass created sketching as the FBI looked over his shoulder and said, this is what I gave Julius Rosenberg. But let's take it deeper. The name on the top, if you can read it, Alexander Feksikov. This was Julius Rosenberg's handler. This is the guy who handled many of the American spies who worked for the Soviet Union during World War II. He becomes famous later on in 1962. Anyone know the name? Anyone know why? He was the back channel during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The guy we kind of sent the whole deal. We'll get rid of the Jupiter missiles, So he becomes much, much more famous after the fact. But he was the handler for that. And he came out in 1995 when Venona had been declassified and said, I handled the Rosenbergs. I handled these guys. Let me tell you a little bit about them. And he specifically said Rosenberg, Julius, was, quote, not directly involved in stealing nuclear secrets from the United States. From the horse's mouth, right? Now, let me tell you why this goes against his self-interest. You might be like, oh, he's just trying to protect his source. Well, protect his source. This is a guy, number one, the Soviet Union had fallen by this point. But how much more credibility would this guy have? He's like, yeah, Julius stole the bomb and I was his handler, right? Talk about the greatest spy handler in history. But he goes against his self-interest and says, nah, didn't really get much from him. Didn't get much from Julius. He was pretty obvious, and he said, we didn't get much from Greenglass. He's a low-level guy at Los Alamos. The last quote is interesting. Ron Radosh is another friend of mine. Ron is about as invested in this story as it gets. Ron wrote a book back in 1983 about the Rosenbergs. He is someone who, to this day, will swear to holy hell that the Rosenbergs were executed correctly. We'll talk about that in a second. But he was forced to kind of say this, and he says, there's no longer any debate among serious people that Julius Rosenberg was a spy for the Soviet Union. We talked about that. At the same time, it is clear that the Rosenbergs did not give the Soviets the secret of the bomb, and they should not have been executed. Now, I'm not taking him out of context. He didn't really want to say this when he did. He's gone against it a little bit. But again, even the people who wanted to swear to their dying breath that the Rosenbergs were bad people were forced to admit that there was a little bit going on to it. So Julius, yes, a spy. I would argue it's problematic to call him an atomic spy. But that's only one side of the issue. Let's look at the other one. Ethel. Ethel, of course, was executed alongside her husband in 1953. This is really what's been a lot of the controversy still today about this story. We talked about Venona. Let's be a little more specific about Venona. Venona was an interesting milestone breakthrough for the United States. This is before the NSA is running around stealing metadata from all over the world and processing billions and billions of communications every day. It's actually a time where the NSA doesn't exist. There's an organization called the Army Security Agency, the ASA, which would later become the NSA, that had been very bad at breaking codes during World War II. They had really not broken anything of consequence. This wasn't like the British who had broken Enigma. This wasn't like the Navy guys who had broken the Japanese naval codes, or like the other group of people working for the ASA who had broken the Japanese diplomatic codes. A man named William Friedman, who became the father of the NSA later on. The ASA had not had any real success under their belt until a man named Meredith Gardner decided to take on the Soviet codes. Now, the Soviet code was supposed to be unbreakable. It used a concept called a one-time pad. And a one-time pad is theoretically the only unbreakable code, still to this day. We can talk about quantum computing all you want to, or any other coding machines. The one-time pad is still to this day the only unbreakable code. It's because you have a pad, a literal pad in some cases, of randomly generated numbers or letters. Your recipient, whoever you're sending a message to, has the same pad. You encode it using one, the recipient decodes it using the other, and then you throw it away. That's that one-time part of the one-time pad. Because it's randomly generated and because you never use it more than once, it cannot be broken. Now, if you use it only once. What the Soviets did is not get lazy. It wasn't that their code breakers was lazy. It was that they were fighting a war, and all their top manufacturers were building tanks and planes and everything else. The one-time pads were given to a substandard manufacturing firm who cut corners and actually reproduced one-time pads more than once. So while Soviet code cipher clerks thought they were actually doing the most secret thing you could do is creating an unbreakable code, they're actually sending the same coded message over and over again. Well, what this allowed Meredith Gardner and the ASA to do is to start to read some of these messages, right? If you get repetition, then you can start breaking codes. In reading them, they got very shocked all of a sudden because our ally, the Soviet Union, was clearly spying on the United States, because what we were able to break was this systematic, one after the next, message from Moscow to New York and Washington talking about people spying for the Soviet Union in the United States. What's interesting to talk about is that the Soviets used code names. So it wasn't like Vince is our spy. He's spying for the Soviet Union. He's a great guy. No, instead they use code names. For instance, these are actually Venona transcripts. Hard to read, but I'll give you a little bit of an idea about what we're looking at here. So you've got certain things in here. You've got things like, let me find, there's liberal and antenna. Liberal and antenna were actually two different code names for Julius Rosenberg, right? So he's in Venona. Thing like Caliber. Caliber was a code name for David Greenglass. Mlad, M-L-A-D, was the code name, actually means young. It was a code name for Ted Hall. Ted Hall was 19. So they weren't very creative. They gave him young as his code name. Seville Sachs, old. Star, so Sachs and Hall were buddies. They were old and young. Gus was actually named Harry Gold, who was the courier. All right, Klaus Fuchs had a code name as well. All these guys had code names. Here's some more. Right? And actually this one is, let's see, I can't even read, I'm 2 feet away from it. Enormous, E-N-O-R-M-O-Z, that was actually the code name for the Manhattan Project, for Los Alamos. So important to look at all these different code names because there's a juxtaposition. Now, here's the key. You can't read this, so I'm gonna read it to you. It says, information on Liberal's wife, Liberal is Julius Rosenberg. Liberal's wife, surname that of her husband, first name Ethel. 29 years old, married 5 years, finished secondary school, a fellow countryman. Now, fellow countryman was a way of saying she was a communist. She was a true believer in communism. Since 1938, sufficiently well-developed politically, knows about her husband's work in the role of meter and mill. These are two spies that Julius had been running. In view of her delicate health, does not work. Is characterized positively and as a devoted person. I talked a lot about code names here. Anything you notice here that's missing? Was that? A code name for who? Ethel, right? Julius is not appearing in Venona. The word Julius does not appear in Venona. The word Klaus Fuchs does not appear in Venona. Ted Hall does not appear in Venona, right? David Greenglass does not appear in Venona. They are code names for every single one of them, but what does appear? Ethel. It's hard, I mean, this is kind of one of these things is not like the other, right? The Sesame Street song, right? Ethel, right? This is the only thing that mentions her, and it mentions her by her real name, Ethel. Now, there's a phrase that my friend Mike Mearpool loves to hammer into the ground, and I'm not sure I agree with him on it, but I want to present you the two sides because it's nuanced. This phrase, in view of delicate health, does not work. Now, you can look at this two ways. Those that argue that Ethel was a spy says it does not work means that she's a housewife. Straightforward, right? Don't overthink it. She's not very healthy, so she doesn't work. She stays home with the kids. Meredith Gardner, who actually broke the Venona codes, doesn't think that idea is right. He's actually seen that phrase does not work dozens and dozens and dozens of times throughout Venona. And he argues that when he sees that, in the other cases, does not work doesn't mean you're a housewife. It means you're not a spy. Does not work is a phrase that pops up all over the place in Venona for people that aren't recruited by the Soviets. Now, Mike loves this phrase, but most of us kind of look at it and go, well, they could literally be saying that she's a housewife, right? How do you differentiate between the two? And the problem you run into is this one. This is another thing that doesn't mention Ethel by name, but it mentions her by inference. To Victor, and Victor was actually Fexkov we're talking about. Lately, the development of new people, Liberal recommended the wife of his wife's brother, Ruth Greenglass, with a safe flat in view. She's 21 years old. She's also a fellow traveler. She lives on where she lives, right? So here, she's an intelligent and clever girl. right? They've learned about the enormous plant in Santa Fe, New Mexico. They were close, Santa Fe, Los Alamos, not all that far away, all right? So here's where we're worried about the problem. Liberal and his wife recommended her as an intelligent and clever girl, right? This is about, should we recruit Ruth Greenglass? And it says liberal and his wife. Now, it doesn't mention Ethel again, it doesn't mention the wife as having a code name, but that sentence right there is problematic for Ethel Rosenberg because it suggests that she was partially involved, that at least she was part of these conversations, that she was there with Julius when he was talking about recruiting these people. So, does not work. We talked about that already. Now, what got Ethel actually executed was a lie. And the lie was told by David Greenglass, her own brother, at the trial. And David said that Ethel actually typed up the notes from these meetings, from this information, and handed that over to the Soviet Union. And that typed notes is what got Ethel convicted. In fact, the judge of the trial, Irvin Kaufman, said that for every hammer note of the typewriter, basically sealed her fate. It was very poetic and dramatic. It turns out that this was a lie. And in 2000, David Greenglass was hunted down by a New York Times reporter named Sam Roberts. And Roberts basically forced Greenglass to kind of talk through this issue. And Greenglass in the year 2000 admitted that Ethel never typed the notes, that he had made that up. And in fact, it was his wife, Ruth, that was the one that typed up the notes. When asked, why would you lie about your sister to get her executed? He's like, well, it was my sister or my wife. And I chose my wife over my sister. Yeah, right, nice guy. And then we have to look back at Alexander Fexikov, what he said about Ethel. He said Ethel never had any direct contact with Soviet intelligence, but conceded that she probably was aware of her husband's activities. Now, I've had a long conversation with Mike and his brother, Robbie Mearpole, about the likelihood that Ethel knew about what Julius was doing. And they will even admit that there's no way that Julius was doing this without Ethel's knowledge. That they were such a close-knit family, that they loved each other so much, there's no way that Ethel did not know what Julius was doing. Now, knowledge is tricky. That's an argument people run into. Does knowing mean you're complicit in all of this? Well, that's where we have to talk about, the last thing. And then I'm done, and then I got questions. That last bullet point where I said the conventional wisdom was that they were convicted and executed for treason is wrong. They're actually convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage. Now, I might sound like I'm being nuanced and I'm using semantics. It's not. It's very important that there's a difference here. 18 U.S. Code, blah, blah, blah. You don't need to know specifically about that. This focuses on espionage, the idea of gathering or delivering information to a foreign government. Subsection C is interesting, and I'll read it to you. It says, if two or more persons conspire to violate this section, and one or more of such persons do any act to affect the object of the conspiracy, each of the parties to such conspiracy shall be subject to the punishment provided for the offense which is the object of such conspiracy. Now, that's a lot of legal mumbo jumbo, but basically what it's saying is that if Ethel and Julius had a conversation about recruiting Greenglass, or about who should be a good spy, or about what Julius was doing, and Ethel suggested, hey, maybe you should take the 5 train instead of the 9 train. She literally has broken the law and has become liable for conspiracy to commit espionage. That's where this nuance comes into play. Now, it sounds, conspiracy to commit espionage, that doesn't sound as bad as treason. Well, what I didn't include was the number 1 penalty for conspiracy to commit espionage is death. And because Julius was clearly a spy, clearly committed espionage, to me there's no question that, I don't believe in the death penalty for anybody, but if he was subject to execution. The problem for Ethel, even though she probably never did any spying for the Soviet Union, even though she's not in Venona anywhere under any kind of code name, if she had a basic conversation with Julius about his espionage activities, she's just as liable under US law as he is. Questions? Or not? I answered every question already, yes. And I'll bring this back up. Comments, complaints? People always want to complain. All right, John.
One of the things we learned from our Russian colleagues when the labs were opened up was that Russian scientists were pretty confident in their design. And the only reason they used the US design was that Beria threatened them with death if it didn't work.
Right.
So instead of trying their design, they said, well, we know the American one worked, so we'll take the safe route. But
Yeah,
they
I
were
mean-
pretty confident in their own design.
I mean, Beria threatened them with death because Beria was going to get killed if it didn't work also.
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, this is a guy who was pretty horrible. Beria was hated by the Soviets more than he was hated by us. He was kind of the architect of the purges. And the only thing that kept him in business, the only reason Stalin didn't kill him also, was because he had infiltrated the Manhattan Project. Not with Julius Rosenberg, but with Klaus Fuchs, with people like Ted Hall and others. And of course, Beria's whole, not only his job, right, you guys get fired if something doesn't work. Beria would have gotten killed in a very disgusting way if the atomic bomb didn't work. But that's exactly what we're talking about. The idea is it wasn't necessary to provide the Soviet scientists with the information other than to justify their livelihoods and their lives in the eyes of their leadership. Because again, they didn't trust their own scientists. I mean, it's tough too, right? I mean, Soviet science was kind of interesting at the time. You had Soviet biology under Stalin was tricky. This is getting really wonky. But the idea is that Soviets kind of had their own view of science based on communism, based on Marxism. And if physics really didn't fit into that very well. Because physics didn't kind of go into this idea that the Soviet wanted to believe under Marxist-Leninism that you can improve yourself. You could create the perfect society, you could create the perfect person. That's why Soviet biology was so weird and crappy. Physics didn't really conform to this, right? You couldn't magically make things better or different with physics. Physics was physics. And so they're very suspicious of quantum mechanics, very suspicious of relativity theory. Going back to Newton, they were suspicious because it wasn't something that they called dialectical materialism could affect. So the Americans doing something or the British doing something and it working was empirical evidence for Stalin. And that's really what kept these scientists alive long enough to build the Soviet bomb. Y'all just want to go home. Up in the back.
The Rosenbergs were executed. Klaus Fuchs went to prison in England. Ted Hall kind of got a pass. Why was that?
This is a fantastic question. Why didn't Ted Hall Ted Hall arguably was the worst of the atomic spies. Ted Hall was the worst because he had access to about everything. And not only did he pass on information about the atomic bomb, but he passed information about the hydrogen bomb. And was one of the key reasons that the Soviets got to the hydrogen bomb as quickly as they did was because of Ted Hall. The problem was there was one source of evidence about Ted Hall's espionage. That was Venona. The only information we had, we knew Ted Hall was a spy. The FBI knew Ted Hall was a spy. Everyone knew Ted Hall was a spy who was cleared into Venona. But you couldn't prosecute him for it. Because if you put him on trial, like you did the Rosenbergs, what do you say? Right? The prosecution can't say, we know he's a spy, you're going to have to trust us. I can't tell you why we know, you're going to have to trust us. Because Venona was as top secret as it gets. Right? You might have heard the phrase sources and methods in the intelligence world. This is as secret of a source. We were reading the Soviets' mail. We didn't want them to know that. We didn't want them to change their codes. We were breaking Venona messages until the 1980s. So Ted Hall got to live the rest of his life, even though he was the worst of the bunch, because we couldn't prosecute him because the only evidence that we had about Ted Hall was from Venona. Interesting decisions being made about this. Actually, it's something that we, not to advertise the Spy Museum, we actually have a gallery that focuses on this exact concept, this question about sources and methods and when do you want things to become public? How do you balance liberty and secrecy? You have to do that in a democracy. Well, Ted Hall's a great example of this, right? Someone we know was arguably the worst spy since Benedict Arnold, and we can't do anything about it. And he gets to live the rest of his life without being touched. because the only evidence was Venona. I thought I saw 2 hands going up. Is there not a second one? No. Over here.
This really doesn't have anything to do with it, but I'm just curious, since you're redoing the museum, are you in the same location?
No, so the question is about the same location of the museum. We've jumped to the other side of the National Mall. So we're now in a place called L'Enfant Plaza. So you may know that well because DOE is like right next to it. All right. So it's a brand new building. It's impossible to miss. All the buildings around us are that brutalist architecture, 1960s stuff like the FBI building, or a big glass building. We basically stand out like glowing in the dark. What's great about it, the reason I was actually hired in the first place, was that we're moving away from the kind of James Bond human intelligence to really embracing science and technology much more than we did before. Because that's reality, right? Espionage is not parachuting out of a perfectly good airplane with a martini in one hand and a stupidly named blonde in the other, right? Intelligence is about using seismology to track North Korean nuclear tests. Intelligence is about spectroscopy to pick up the Soviet atomic bomb. Intelligence is about understanding neuroscience so our analysts can get rid of cognitive biases, right? So the whole museum's not a science museum, but there's a lot more in there. So I think for people who have gone, yeah, sure, all right, James Bond stuff, or people have gone like this is all about spies. No, I think we're growing up. And we're certainly branching out to try to understand the broader. I think we were a spy museum before, and now we're going to be a true intelligence museum. We're not going to change the name's the brand, but we're really truly an intelligence museum now than we were before. You know, we open beginning of May. You know. In Sing Sing, right? Austining, New York, electric chair. Both on the same day. Ethel went first. And Julius went easy. This is so their granddaughter, Ivy Mearpool, has actually made a documentary called Heir to an Execution, where in very vivid detail talks about the execution. Julius went first. He went easy. Ethel, not so much. She survived twice them trying to electrocute her. Yeah, there's some pretty interesting stories about smell and hair catching on fire and stuff. She went bad, but yeah, they were both executed in 1953. And from 1953, actually from 1951, but 1953 to 1995, when Venona was declassified, their children tried to vindicate them. And then in 1995, the world changed dramatically. When Venona was declassified, all of a sudden their parents were spies, or at least their dad was. Mike is still trying to get Ethel vindicated. They actually applied for a pardon to President Obama before he left office that they didn't do. The Obama administration did not agree to do it. I'm not sure why, because who would have gotten mad about that? I'm not sure who. Maybe some people would have, but so they're still fighting for the Ethel. You know, basically the two arguments I made tonight is really kind of the juxta of the argument still about the Rosenbergs. One is that there was no atomic spying really going on of any consequence, and two is that Ethel was relatively innocent, certainly shouldn't have been executed. Everything else has been settled, is settled history at this point. No. All right.
Thank you very much. It's 9 o'clock. We're done. Thank you very much for coming. Please be extremely careful and safe going home out there tonight. Who knows what you're going to walk into when you go out the door.